There is a version of history where Nikola Tesla is the richest man who ever lived. Not Rockefeller, not Carnegie, not Morgan. Tesla. And there is a real version of history, the one that actually happened, where this same man died alone in a small hotel room, unable to pay his bill, surrounded by pigeons he fed by hand because he trusted them more than people. Both of these things are true about the same person. That gap.
What Tesla could have been and what he became is the entire story we are about to tell. And by the time we reach the end of it, you may find yourself questioning how many other Teslas history has quietly erased in exactly the same way. This is not a story about a mad scientist chasing impossible dreams. It is a story about a man who solved some of the biggest problems humanity has ever faced, and was then systematically pushed out of the very history books that should have celebrated him. By the end of this documentary, you will understand why Albert Einstein and Thomas Edison get entire chapters in science textbooks, while Nikola Tesla barely gets a paragraph, even though many historians and engineers argue he was more important than both of them combined. Before any of that, though, you have to understand where this man actually came from, because it explains a lot about who he became. Nikola Tesla was born at the stroke of midnight in July 1856 in the village of Smiljan, in what was then part of the Austrian Empire and is today Croatia. His father was an Eastern Orthodox priest, his mother an inventor in her own right who built small household tools and machines despite having no formal education. From an early age, Tesla showed an almost frightening ability to visualize entire machines in his head, down to individual moving parts, before ever building a single prototype. He studied engineering and physics in Graz and Prague, and by his early 20s, he already had a clear, almost obsessive vision, a motor that could run on alternating current, something the leading electrical minds of Europe at the time considered close to impossible. In 1884, with almost nothing to his name, Tesla left Europe for the United States, arriving in New York with 4 cents in his pocket, a handful of poems, and a letter of recommendation to Thomas Edison himself. Edison hired him, and for a while the two men worked side by side, but it did not last. Edison was firmly, almost stubbornly committed to direct current and had little patience for Tesla's alternating current theories. According to accounts from that period, Edison even promised Tesla $50,000 if he could redesign and improve Edison's inefficient DC generators. Tesla did the work, delivered the improvements, and when he asked for the money, Edison reportedly laughed it off, saying it had only been a joke, an American sense of humor Tesla, as a European immigrant, simply hadn't understood. Tesla resigned on the spot. That single moment of betrayal, more than any grand ideological difference, is often cited as the real spark that turned two brilliant inventors into lifelong rivals. Now, let's start with what Tesla actually gave the world, because most people only know the surface version of this. The alternating current system, the one that powers almost every home and factory on Earth today, is Tesla's invention. The foundation of wireless communication, the basic science behind radio, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth traces back to Tesla's experiments decades before anyone else understood what he was doing. Neon lighting, modern electric motors, transformers, radar, remote control devices, and early X-ray imaging all carry his fingerprints. He held close to 300 patents by the end of his life. If you strip Tesla's contributions out of the modern world, you are not left with a slightly less advanced version of today. You are left with a different century altogether. Now compare that to how he died. January 1943, Hotel New Yorker, room 3327. An 86-year-old man is found dead in his bed by a hotel maid named Alice Monahan. He had lived in that hotel for 9 years, and for most of those years, he had not been able to pay his own rent. His room bill was being quietly covered, not by Tesla, but by George Westinghouse, the very industrialist Tesla had once done business with decades earlier. The official cause of death was coronary thrombosis, essentially a blood clot that stopped his heart. There's no credible medical evidence that he was murdered, but what happened in the hours after his death is where the real story gets strange, and where the real questions begin. To understand how a man capable of lighting up entire cities ended up broke and alone in a hotel room, we have to go back to the beginning, to a rivalry that changed the modern world, and quietly, ruined Tesla's finances forever. Picture the world before 1880. Homes are lit by candles and oil lamps. Electricity is a laboratory curiosity, not something ordinary families use. Then Thomas Edison starts the Edison Electric Light Company, and by 1879, he has a working light bulb. It's a genuine breakthrough. But Edison's entire business is built on direct current, or DC, and DC has a serious weakness. It can only travel 2 to 3 kilometers before it becomes too weak to use. That means power stations have to be built every few blocks in every city, which is expensive to build and expensive to maintain. And that cost gets passed straight to the customer. Because there was no real alternative at the time, DC became the accepted standard, and Edison made an enormous amount of money from that monopoly. Then, in 1888, Nikola Tesla enters the picture. He presents a paper to the American Institute of Electrical Engineers describing a new system of alternating current motors and transformers. This is alternating current, or AC, and it does something DC simply cannot do. It can travel hundreds of kilometers with far less energy loss, and it's significantly cheaper to produce. Word spreads fast. Engineers, investors, and industrialists start paying attention, and one of them is George Westinghouse, a Pittsburgh industrialist who instantly understands what Tesla has built. In 1888, Tesla signs a deal with Westinghouse. He hands over his AC patents in exchange for $60,000 in cash and stock, a monthly salary of $2,000 to keep working, and most importantly, a royalty of $2.50 for every horsepower of AC electricity sold. That royalty clause is the part that matters most, because as AC power spread across the country, that royalty stream grew into an enormous fortune. By 1890, just 3 years after signing the deal, Tesla was already a millionaire. Historians and engineers who have studied the numbers agree that if that royalty agreement had simply continued to run its course, Tesla would very likely have become the world's first billionaire. But Edison was not going to let his empire collapse without a fight, and what he did next is one of the ugliest chapters in the history of American business. Unable to beat Tesla's system on merit, Edison launched a public fear campaign against alternating current. He and his associates publicly electrocuted stray dogs and cats to demonstrate how dangerous AC supposedly was. In one especially grim public display, they even electrocuted an elephant. Edison's camp also helped develop the electric chair, deliberately using AC current in its design so that the public would associate alternating current with death in the most literal way possible. Tesla fought back, not with fear, but with demonstration. He appeared in public and passed alternating current through his own body to show that, handled correctly, AC was not the killer Edison claimed it was. For a few years, the two camps fought this public relations war side by side. Then, 2 real-world events settled the argument for good. The first was the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. Organizers needed a system powerful enough to light the entire fair, and they had 2 bids on the table: Edison's General Electric with their DC system, and Westinghouse's company using Tesla's AC system. Westinghouse won the contract at roughly half the cost Edison's company had quoted, and Tesla's AC system lit up more than 200,000 light bulbs at once, a scale nobody had ever seen before. It was the moment the public finally understood, in a very visible way, just how far ahead of DC this new system really was. The second event was the Niagara Falls Power Project. Around the turn of the century, a group of industrialists wanted to harness the power of Niagara Falls and transmit that electricity to nearby Buffalo, New York, a distance DC simply could not cover. In 1895, the contract went to Westinghouse's company, and using Tesla's AC generators, they successfully transmitted power across roughly 30 to 40 kilometers, a distance that was completely outside the realm of possibility for Edison's direct current. Between the Chicago World's Fair and Niagara Falls, the so-called War of Currents was effectively over. Tesla and Westinghouse had won, and to this day, roughly 90% of the world's electricity, from your home to major industrial plants, runs on some version of the AC system Tesla pioneered. By the end of 1897, Westinghouse was on the verge of bankruptcy, owing Tesla well over $1 million in accumulated royalties, a number that kept growing every single day. George Westinghouse went to Tesla directly and explained the situation plainly. If the royalty payments continued at their current rate, the company might not survive, and Edison's DC system, or worse, Morgan's takeover, could end up controlling the very technology Tesla had invented to serve the public. Tesla's response to this is one of the single most consequential decisions in the history of American industry. He tore up the royalty contract, voluntarily. He walked away from a fortune that historians estimate would have been worth well over $100 million at the time, and vastly more when you calculate what those AC royalties would be worth today, running into the billions. In doing this, Tesla single-handedly saved the Westinghouse company, and by extension, made sure that Edison's more expensive, more limited DC system never came to dominate the world's power grid.
Why would a man do that? This is where you have to understand something about how Tesla actually thought. He wasn't chasing wealth. He said this himself, plainly, that he cared less about money than most people assumed, and that he had put his own fortune into experiments he believed could genuinely make human life easier. He worked 20-hour days. He lived alone. He never married, in part because he didn't want any relationship to slow down his work. He genuinely, deeply believed his purpose was to serve humanity, not to accumulate a personal fortune. It is an admirable belief. It is also, as his life would go on to prove, an extremely dangerous one if you are trying to survive inside a capitalist economy that runs entirely on profit.
Because tearing up that contract did more than cost Tesla his royalty income. It set the stage for the final, most devastating chapter of his career, a project that could have changed the entire relationship between humanity and electricity, and the very people who were supposed to fund it. That project was the Wardenclyffe Tower, built on Long Island, New York, and it was Tesla's most ambitious dream. His vision was audacious, even by today's standards. Using this tower, Tesla believed he could transmit both electricity and information wirelessly, and do it cheaply enough that ordinary households would never need to pay another electricity bill again. According to Tesla himself, the same technology could carry phone calls, messages, and even images across the world, wirelessly, decades before anyone else was seriously attempting anything like it. To build something this ambitious, Tesla needed serious money, and he turned to one of the most powerful financiers in the
country, J.P. Morgan, the same man whose earlier stock manipulation had nearly destroyed Westinghouse. Tesla convinced Morgan to invest around $150,000 by framing Wardenclyffe primarily as a wireless communication project, positioning himself as a rival to Guglielmo Marconi, who was racing to develop his own radio transmission system. Morgan, aware of Tesla's track record with AC, took the bet. Construction began, but a project this ambitious quickly consumed the initial funding, and Tesla went back to Morgan, asking for more. This time, he made the mistake that would end his career as a serious industrial player. He told Morgan the full scope of his vision, that Wardenclyffe wasn't just about sending messages, it was about broadcasting electricity itself, freely, to the entire world. Morgan, a businessman first and foremost, asked the obvious question. If electricity is free and wireless, where exactly does the meter go? How does anyone get paid? Tesla's answer effectively confirmed Morgan's worst fear. There would be no meter. People wouldn't have to pay for electricity at all. Morgan, who had just funded a project expecting a commercial return, understood immediately that Tesla's dream, if it succeeded, would not make him money. It would destroy the entire business model that men like Morgan had built their fortunes on. Morgan refused further funding, and according to multiple historical accounts, made it clear to other major financiers of the era that investing in Tesla was a bad idea, effectively shutting him out of the capital markets that any large-scale inventor needs to keep working. Wardenclyffe was abandoned, unfinished, and later demolished for scrap during World War I to help pay off Tesla's mounting debts. Without funding, without financial backers willing to touch his name, Tesla's ability to turn his ideas into working technology essentially died with that tower. A scientist without capital cannot build. And that, more than any single conspiracy, is the mechanism that quietly ended Tesla's career. He hadn't just lost a business deal. He had challenged the basic economic order that people like Edison, Westinghouse, and Morgan had all learned to work within. And the system responded by cutting him off entirely.
This financial collapse is what led directly to the final, strange chapter of Tesla's life, one that has fed conspiracy theories for 80 years and deserves to be examined honestly, both for what is documented fact and what is genuine speculation. By 1930, Tesla was living at the Hotel Governor Clinton, and by 1934, he owed the hotel several $100s in unpaid bills. Some accounts put the figure closer to $2,000, money he simply did not have. To cover the debt, Tesla reportedly handed the hotel owner a locked box as collateral, telling him it contained an invention worth millions of dollars, something he called a death ray, and warning the owner never to open it or let it fall into untrained hands. Given Tesla's reputation, the hotel owner accepted the box on trust rather than immediately forcing the issue. Tesla was eventually asked to leave that hotel over his unpaid debts and moved to the Hotel New Yorker in 1934, where George Westinghouse quietly arranged to cover his monthly rent, a small act of loyalty from an old business partner. Tesla stayed there for the rest of his life, 9 years, until his death in January 1943. When Tesla died, both his rooms at the New Yorker and that mysterious box left behind at the Governor Clinton Hotel were seized. The man assigned to examine Tesla's papers and that box was Dr. John G. Trump, an MIT engineer, and, notably, the uncle of a young Donald Trump. When the box was finally opened, it did not contain a working death ray. It contained a decades-old multi-decimal resistance box, a fairly ordinary electrical component dressed up to look mysterious. Whether Tesla was bluffing to secure credit or whether the real research existed elsewhere is genuinely unresolved. What is documented is that Tesla did claim, publicly, at a gathering at the Hotel New Yorker in 1937, that he had actually built and demonstrated a version of a charged particle beam weapon, and that it was only a matter of time before he could share it with the world. Whether that claim was true, exaggerated, or simply the words of an aging man trying to stay relevant, historians still disagree. What is not in dispute is what happened after his death. Within hours of Tesla's body being discovered, agents connected to the U.S. Office of Alien Property showed up and seized his belongings, roughly 80 trunks of papers, patents, and research materials in total. This is where the story gets genuinely strange, because Tesla had been a naturalized United States citizen for decades. The Office of Alien Property existed specifically to seize the property of foreign nationals during wartime, not citizens. So why did it apply here? The documented answer involves Tesla's nephew, Sava Kosanovic, a Yugoslav diplomat living in the United States at the time, who had suspected ties to the Communist Party. This was 1943, the height of World War II, and while the Soviet Union was technically allied with the US against Germany at that moment, American officials were already deeply wary of Soviet influence and communist sympathizers. The fear, as documented in FBI files, was straightforward. If Tesla's research fell into Kosanovic's hands, it could end up in Soviet possession, at a moment when the US government considered any leak of advanced technology a serious national security risk. That fear, real or exaggerated, was enough to justify seizing an American citizen's estate without a court order. For years afterward, Tesla's family repeatedly petitioned the US government for the return of his papers. In 1952, the government finally returned a portion of the seized materials, and those documents eventually made their way to the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, where they remain today. But of the roughly 80 trunks originally seized, government records confirm only about 7 trunks were actually returned. The rest were never accounted for. In 1975, Serbian museum officials formally requested the remaining materials again. They never received a response. In 2016, 73 years after Tesla's death, the FBI finally declassified a portion of its file on him. According to the engineer who evaluated the papers at the time, John Trump himself, there was nothing in Tesla's papers that he considered of significant value to the country, essentially confirming that most of what was seized was speculative, unfinished, or simply the sprawling notes of a brilliant but disorganized mind in decline. And yet, decades later, some of the material remains unreleased, and the US government has never fully explained why documents belonging to a man who died in 1943 would still be considered a national security concern today. That contradiction,
officially calling the material worthless while also refusing to release all of it, is the single strangest, most legitimate open question in this entire story.
And it is the reason Tesla conspiracy theories have had so much room to grow for the better part of a century. That single demonstration captures something essential about Tesla as an inventor. He wasn't simply improving on existing technology the way many of his contemporaries were. He was routinely inventing entire categories of technology that the rest of the world would not catch up to for generations. Wireless remote control in 1898, functional radio patents years before Marconi, X-ray imaging experiments conducted independently around the same time Wilhelm Röntgen was making his own discoveries in Germany, and early theoretical work on radar principles that would not become practical technology until the Second World War, decades after Tesla first wrote about the underlying concepts in the overlying concepts. Being that far ahead of your own era is often described as a gift. In Tesla's case, it was also quietly a curse, because the financial and industrial systems of his time were simply not built to reward ideas that hadn't happened yet. So where does that leave us? Was there a literal, functioning death ray sitting in a hotel room, deliberately covered up by the American government? The honest answer, based on the historical record, is that there is no solid evidence of that. What we do have is a man who made grand claims, a government that overreacted out of wartime paranoia, and decades of secrecy that, whether intentional or bureaucratic, created the perfect conditions for myths to take root. Before we get to the fall, it's worth pausing on just how far ahead of his own century Tesla actually was, because one demonstration in particular still sounds like science fiction even today. In 1898, at an electrical exhibition inside Madison Square Garden in New York, Tesla unveiled a small iron-hulled boat floating in a tank of water, and then, standing well away from it with no visible wires or connections, he steered the boat left and right, started and stopped its motor, and even flashed its lights using a small wireless control box
in his hand. The crowd was stunned. Some spectators reportedly assumed it had to be trickery, magic, or even a trained animal hidden inside the hull, because the idea of controlling a machine without touching it or wiring it directly was simply outside what anyone in 1898 believed was possible. What they had just watched, without fully realizing it, was the first working demonstration of radio-controlled robotics in human history, decades before the word robotics even existed. Tesla himself understood exactly what he had built, and predicted, correctly, that machines like it would one day be used in warfare, industry, and eventually, in ways he could only vaguely imagine, in the everyday objects of ordinary life.
There is one more piece of this puzzle that deserves its own moment, because it is rarely told properly. In 1897, years before Guglielmo Marconi sent his famous first transatlantic radio signal, Tesla had already filed detailed patents describing the fundamental components of radio transmission. When Marconi achieved his celebrated breakthrough in 1901, he was, according to the patent record, building directly on top of ideas Tesla had already protected legally. Marconi went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics for inventing radio. Tesla, meanwhile, spent years watching another man collect the credit and the money for a system built on his own foundational patents. It wasn't until 1943, the same year Tesla died, that the United States Supreme Court finally ruled on a separate patent dispute, and in doing so, quietly overturned several of Marconi's key radio patents, effectively acknowledging that Tesla's earlier work took priority. The ruling came too late for Tesla to see it, too late for it to change a single dollar of the fortune Marconi and his backers had already made, and too late to undo a Nobel Prize that history had already handed to someone else. It is one of the clearest examples in this entire story of Tesla being proven right by the very institutions that had ignored him, decades after it could do him any good.
There's also a quieter, more human side to this story that rarely makes it into the technical history books. And it matters, because it explains exactly how a man this brilliant ended up this alone. As Tesla aged, his mind, the same mind capable of visualizing an entire AC motor before building it, began working against him in smaller, sadder ways. He developed an intense fear of germs that made him wash his hands obsessively and avoid shaking hands with almost anyone. He became fixated on the number 3,
insisting on circling a building 3 times before entering it, and demanding exactly 18 napkins be set at his dinner table before he would sit down to eat. He developed a strange aversion to round objects, particularly pearls, reportedly refusing to be near a woman wearing them. He never married, and told people directly that he believed a wife and family would have slowed down the work he considered his true purpose in life.
In his final years, his closest companionship wasn't with people at all. It was with the pigeons he fed by hand near his hotel window. One bird in particular that he described in his own words as something he loved as deeply as a person could love another person. When that pigeon eventually died, Tesla reportedly told friends that something in him died with it. In his final years, his closest companionship wasn't with people at all. It was with the pigeons he fed by hand near his hotel window. One bird in particular that he described in his own words as something he loved as deeply as a person could love another person. When that pigeon eventually died, Tesla reportedly told friends that something in him died with it. But strip away the conspiracy theories entirely, and you are still left with something remarkable and genuinely troubling. A man who helped build the modern electrical grid, whose foundational work underpins wireless communication as we know it, tore up a fortune to save a friend's company, then lost the ability to fund his own research the moment his vision stopped being profitable for the men holding the money. Thomas Edison built General Electric into one of the largest companies on Earth. George Westinghouse became a millionaire. Guglielmo Marconi, who historians now widely acknowledge used several of Tesla's own patents in developing radio, received a Nobel Prize for it. And Tesla, the man whose work made almost all of it possible, spent his final years feeding pigeons in a New York hotel room he couldn't afford, dying with barely enough left to cover his own funeral costs. Textbooks found room for Einstein. They found room for Edison. Somehow, the man many engineers consider the more prolific and in some ways more visionary inventor of the two barely earned a footnote. Whether that is an accident of history or a quieter, slower version of what happened to his tower and his funding, a genuinely disruptive mind being gradually written out of a story that the existing order preferred to tell without him, is something you can decide for yourself. And it is exactly
the kind of question worth sitting with long after this documentary ends. Tesla himself seemed to expect exactly this outcome. Late in his life, he said that the present belongs to other men, but the future belongs to him, and that history would eventually decide who actually did the real work. It's easy to read a line like that as simple bitterness from an old man who felt cheated. But looking back, with everything we now know, it reads more like a quiet, accurate prediction from someone who genuinely understood how far ahead of his moment he really was. There is also a broader lesson sitting underneath all of this, one that goes well beyond one inventor's unpaid hotel bills. Societies tend to celebrate innovation, but only the kind of innovation that fits neatly inside the economic system already in place. An invention that makes existing industries more profitable gets funded, promoted, and remembered. An invention that threatens to make an entire industry unnecessary?
free wireless electricity for every household on Earth, for example, tends to get quietly starved of capital instead, regardless of how brilliant the person behind it happens to be. Tesla wasn't destroyed by a single villain or a single decision. He was slowly filtered out by a system that had no mechanism for rewarding an idea that didn't come with a meter attached to it. 90 years after his death, he is remembered as one of the most important scientific minds in history. His name attached to an electric car company, a unit of magnetic field strength, university lecture halls, and a growing wave of documentaries just like this one. Engineers and physicists who study his original papers today still find ideas in them worth pursuing. Some of his more speculative concepts, wireless power transmission chief among them, are quietly being revisited by modern researchers using tools and materials Tesla never had access to. Maybe that is Tesla's real vindication. Not a hidden weapon in a locked box, not a secret government file, but the simple, slow, decades-late realization that the man everyone stopped listening to had actually been right the entire time.